Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Landscapes Live seminar. This week, we are very happy to host Victor Sacek, who is going to bring us to South America, talking about pardon me, that's a bad start for me. Andean geodynamics and the landscape evolution in Amazonia. We are going to continue then the seminar series next week with Julia Cisneros. And I see also that Pedro has just joined us. He will be the main host, and I will be the co-host today. We are going to listen to Victor, who has a PhD in geophysics that he earned in 2011 at the University of Sao Paulo. He also came to visit us in Europe during his PhD, spending half a year in Grenoble, working with Jean Braun and Peter van der Beek. After his PhD, he was hired at the University of Sao Paulo. And 10 years later, he came back to us in Europe for a year of sabbatical in Tübingen with Todd Ehlers. And he's now associate professor of geophysics at the University of Sao Paulo. I will be running this seminar as usual. So if you have any questions, write them in the chat. We will make sure to read them to Victor at the end. We will just keep the chat closed for the first half of the seminar, and we will open it towards the end. This seminar is recorded, will be uploaded to YouTube, and you can always go check what we have in our large library of talks. You might be the number 100, or maybe just not. We are close to having 100 talks, so maybe you will be cracking this number. We'll see. I forgot where we are exactly. On that note, Pedro, did I forget anything?
This is perfect. And I just wanted to say it's a huge pleasure to have Victor here. And yeah, the floor is yours.
All right, Victor.
So thank you very much, Luca, for the introduction. Pedro, thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And today I will discuss about some of the papers that we and projects that we developed in our research group. And the title is this one, on geodynamics and landscape evolution in Amazonia. And first of all, I will give some idea about the motivation of the research. So the Amazon drainage basin is unique in many ways. It's the largest drainage basin on Earth, covering nearly 1/3 of the South American continent. It has the largest water discharge in the world, accounting for 1/6 of the global total. And the Amazon forest harbors a vast biodiversity with 40% of the butterflies in the world and nearly 1/3 of the bird species. So it's huge. And the main question is, how did this huge drainage basin evolve during the uplift of the Andean Cordillera? So this is probably the main question in this research. And first of all, I will give some previous published models about the Amazonia through time. And one important model was done by Karina Horn in this paper, showing the collaboration of different geoscientists and biologists, combining paleontological, stratigraphic data, palynological data, showing a possible model that described the evolution of Amazonia since the last 50 million years. So in their model, nearly 30 million years ago, there was no transcontinental Amazon River. There was a drainage pattern flowing parallel to the Andean Cordillera, flowing to the Caribbean Sea, and another smaller drainage basin flowing to the equatorial margin. During the Miocene, a huge aquatic environment was developed in the Western Amazonia called Peba system, covering a large fraction of the Western Amazonia. And due to Andean uplift, this aquatic environment disappeared, and we observed the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River connecting the Andean Cordillera with the equatorial margin, with increased Andean-derived sediments nearly 7 million years ago, with a configuration similar to this until the present time. Important constraints about the evolution of the drainage evolution in Amazonia comes from the offshore data, especially in the Amazon Fund. Well data indicate that a shift in sediment provenance from the Cratonic domain to the Andean Cordillera nearly 9 million years ago. So it's possible to see a shift in the provenance nearly 10 million years ago in the Amazon Fund, showing the transition from the Cratonic source to the Andean source, with an increase in the sedimentation rate during the last 7 million years. Can you see my arrow? Yes?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yes.
Good. However, there is no absolute consensus about the paleoenvironment evolution in Amazonia, and different authors suggested different models about the paleoenvironment in Amazonia. Here I present qualitative ternary plot showing contribution from fluvial, marine, or lacustrine environment. And different authors proposed different environments, especially for the Peba system during the Miocene in the western portion of Amazonia. Some authors proposed essentially a marine environment covering Amazonia for millions of years. Others proposed a long-lived mega lake wetland system. Other workers proposed no environment influence. And we have other researchers that proposed a mixture of fluvial, marine, and lacustrine environment in Amazonia. Especially about the work from Jaramillo, 2017, there's evidence of marine incursions in the interior of the Amazon drainage basin, reaching the present Colombia and northern of Brazil, where it's possible to find evidence of marine organisms in the sedimentary basin. And they proposed an intermittent influence of the marine environment, mainly from the Caribbean Sea during the last 20 million years. And maybe the problem about the problem with the consensus about the paleoenvironment evolution in Amazonia comes from the fragmented observational data, both in space and time. So maybe this is the source, the reason why we have so many different models to explain the paleoenvironment evolution in Amazonia. And probably we can fill the gaps with numerical models. So the idea is that based on different numerical models, we can try to understand the main process that guided the evolution of Amazonia during the last 40 million years. And probably the first quantitative model proposed to explain the paleoenvironment evolution in Amazonia was published by Grace Shepard and others, proposing that the dynamic topography was a key factor that controlled both the formation of the huge aquatic environment in Western Amazonia and also guided the the reversal or the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River connecting the Andes and the equatorial margin. So here I show 4 snapshots showing the transition, the vertical perturbation in dynamic topography during the last 40 million years, showing that in the past we observed a huge subsidence region, and this region was this pattern was replaced by a large uplift in Western Amazonia. So first of all, what is dynamic topography? So dynamic topography is any vertical perturbation in the earth induced by mantle convection. So this is different from isostatic topography. So here's a paper from John Brown showing the difference between tectonic topography on the right and dynamic topography on the left. So the tectonic topography is mainly guided by changes in crustal thickness or lithospheric thickness too. On the other hand, dynamic topography is induced by the convection in the mantle. So low density material in the mantle will induce upward movement in the mantle and inducing the formation of a swell at the surface. On the other hand, cold material will induce a depression at the surface. As an example, I show a thermomechanical model that we developed in our research group, showing in orange is the lithosphere, in green the asthenospheric mantle, and in the center we imposed a dense material, and in the upper panel we showed the surface in this model, and we can see that when we run the model, the downward movement of this dense plume induce a vertical perturbation of a few hundreds of meters, but with wavelength of thousands of kilometers. So this is an example of dynamic topography, in this case, a negative dynamic topography. This is something similar that we observe in the western margin in South America. We have the subduction of the Nazca Plate under the western portion of South America, and this downward movement of the plate induce downward movement of the asthenospheric mantle and perturbs the surface, inducing the subsidence of the continent with amplitudes of a few hundreds of meters. And this amplitude and wavelength depends on the viscosity of the mantle. And in their model, they tried to base it on tomographic data, based on seismological data. They tried to simulate mantle convection backward in time and see how the plate, the oceanic plate was in the past, and try to see the perturbation at the surface. And then they predicted this change in dynamic topography, where back to 45 million years ago, they predicted a depression in Western Amazonia. And then this depression was replaced by an uplift. And this induced a tilt in a continental scale. And they proposed that the influence of this mantle convection affect the development of this huge aquatic environment in Western Amazonia that was replaced by the transcontinental Amazon River. However, this model just superposed this long wavelength perturbation due to mantle convection on the present topography. So there is no Andean uplift and no surface process in their model. So the idea in our group was to try to simulate the landscape evolution, combining surface process of erosion and sedimentation and other geodynamic process. So the idea is that we have a combination of process that guided the evolution of the landscape in northern South America. We had the mantle convection, but we had Andean orogeny, climate change, surface process, and isostatic effects and flexure in the lithosphere. So I proposed a different numerical model combining Andean orogeny, surface process of erosion and sedimentation, and flexure and isostasy. So in this case, the Andean orogeny will affect the surface process and will create a vertical load over the lithosphere that will be compensated isostatically and flexurally. Additionally, the vertical displacement of the lithosphere due to isostasy and flexure will affect the surface process, and the surface process will redistribute the material at the surface with erosion and sedimentation, affecting the flexural and isostatic equilibrium of the lithosphere. So the idea of flexure and isostasy is that any vertical load in the lithosphere is partially supported by the asthenosphere due to the buoyancy effect of the asthenosphere, and partially by the rigidity of the lithosphere. So this load Q is supported by isostasy and the rigidity of the lithosphere, where D represents the rigidity of the plate, and T in the expression for D represents the effective elastic thickness, which is a measure for the parameter that controls the rigidity of the lithosphere. As an example, we can see the load of the Andean Cordillera and the impact of this load on the foreland basins in northern South America. We can see, for example, here we have this is an example I use in my classes, where the students can simulate the flexure induced by the load of the Andes. So here's the bending of the lithosphere induced by the load of the Andean Cordillera. And this load creates adjacent depression, which is the foreland basin. And the shape of the foreland basin depends on the rigidity of the lithosphere. If we test a smaller rigidity with an effective elastic thickness of, for example, 20 kilometers, we obtain a narrow foreland basin. On the other hand, if we increase the flexural rigidity of the plate, the foreland basin is wider. And the effective elastic thickness map for South America, we can observe that along the Andean Cordillera, we have low flexural rigidity, and in the interior of the continent, we have high flexural rigidity. And here is a map of the foreland basins and the thickness of the foreland basins in kilometers. So this was created essentially by the load of the Andean Cordillera. About orogeny, here I present an image from Paul Bishop showing the different geodynamic process that guide that are interacting during the formation of during the orogeny evolution. And this is not exactly the same problem in South America. We have the interaction between an oceanic plate and a continental plate, but we can explain the formation of the Cordillera as a contraction, horizontal contraction of the crust and consequent crustal thickening. As an example, I will show one thermomechanical model developed in our research group, showing the collision of two lithospheric plates, where we have the formation of the Cordillera in this case. And it's important to see that due to the high concentration of radiogenic elements in the upper crust, the formation of the orogen induces the uplift of the isotherms. So this makes the lithosphere warmer under the Cordillera, and this explains why the flexural rigidity along the Andes is smaller than the flexural rigidity in the interior of the continent. In our simplified model of surface process and lithospheric process, the crustal thickening along the Andean Cordillera is an imposed factor, but the uplift of the Andes, the altitude of the Andes is derived during the simulation. So the change in topography through time depends on crustal thickening rate, isostasy and flexure, and erosion. So the combination of these processes will guide the landscape evolution. For the surface process, we considered a simple formulation where we have the sediment transport capacity that depends on the slope of the landscape and water discharge, with the K in a fluvial coefficient. And in our model, the topography changes through time depending on the sediment transport capacity at each point of the model, and depends on the local sediment flux. And the difference between them will say if we will observe erosion or sedimentation. So when the sediment flux is larger than the equilibrium flux, we will obtain sedimentation. On the other hand, if the sediment flux is smaller than the equilibrium flux, we will have erosion. And when both are equal, we will have steady state configuration, no deposition and no erosion. In our model, the surface is subdivided into cells. These points are interconnected by a Delaunay triangulation. This is the description of the discretization of the surface. And each point is represents the center of a Voronoi cell. And we define an initial topography, and we assume that the fluvial transport between cells occurs in the steepest direction. In our first model, we assumed a simplified geographical representation of North and South America, where here we have the Andean Cordillera, and the initial topography assumed the Guyana shield and the Brazilian shield, and here's the equatorial margin, and here's the Caribbean Sea. So the first model, the simplified model, showed the development of aquatic environment in Western Amazonia along the foreland basins that disappears through time when we observe the increase in sedimentation derived from the erosion of the Andes. And at a certain moment, we observe the river capture and the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River, connecting the Andean Cordillera with the equatorial margin. We see initially we have a river flowing northward, and then we have the capture and the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River. And what's important here is that there is no dynamic topography in this scenario, only the interaction of flexure, orogeny, and surface process. So here's the same scenario where I painted the rivers flowing to the Caribbean Sea in red and the rivers flowing to the equatorial margin in yellow. And we can observe the river capture through time. So this was our first model trying to describe the landscape evolution in North and South America. Later, my former PhD student, Tassio Bicudo, incorporated mantle convection in our model. So combined our landscape evolution with flexural effects with the influence of dynamic topography. So in this case, we have an additional geodynamic process. And one important difference between dynamic topography and flexure of the lithosphere is the shape of the vertical perturbation at the surface. So when the dynamic topography induces vertical perturbations of the order of hundreds of meters and wavelength of thousands of kilometers. On the other hand, flexure of the lithosphere can induce vertical displacements of the order of a few kilometers, but wavelength of hundreds of kilometers. So we have the superposition of these two effects. And Tassio tried to incorporate and see the effect of the combination of these two processes. So he improved the geographical representation of North and South America. And here is one of his simulations where there is no dynamic topography. Initially, we observed an aquatic environment only along the foreland basins, and this aquatic environment disappears. And then we observed the formation of the transcontinental river connecting the Andean Cordillera with the equatorial margin. But when Tassio Bicudo incorporated the influence of dynamic topography, it was possible to reproduce huge aquatic environment covering a large fraction of Western Amazonia. And then this aquatic environment disappears, and we have the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River. So we observed that the dynamic topography can contribute to explain the expansion of these aquatic environment to the interior of the Amazon drainage basin. And this aquatic environment is not limited to the foreland basin, but can be expanded to the center of Amazonia. And there is an impact on stratigraphic evolution. So we extracted one profile from the foreland basins to the equatorial margin, and we can see the impact on the thickness of the sedimentary basins. Without dynamic topography, the maximum thickness in the Solomons basins up to half kilometer. But when we incorporate dynamic topography, we can explain total sedimentary thickness of nearly 1 kilometer, which is closer to the observed thickness in the Solomons, the Cenozoic sedimentation in the Solomons basin. So maybe part of the sedimentary layer in the interior of Amazonia is preserved, sustained by dynamic topography, negative dynamic topography. And here are some snapshots of these simulations where we can see the difference in aquatic environments without dynamic topography and with dynamic topography. In another work done by Tassio Cordeiro Bicudo, he explored the impact of these paleoenvironment models on the biodiversity in Amazonia. So first of all, I will present this picture where usually we think about the Amazon forest as a continuous rainforest, but in fact, it's a mosaic of different forests. For example, we have the Várzea forest, which are seasonally flooded forests with rivers eroding the Andean Cordillera and bringing nutrients to the Amazon plain. So this is one kind of forest, the Várzea forest. On the other hand, we have the Igapó forest, seasonally flooded forest, but with rivers originating in the shields where the erosion rate is much smaller than the Andes. So these rivers are poor in nutrients. So the biodiversity of these two forests is completely different. So we have the forest, one kind of organisms in the Várzea forests with the rivers flowing from the Andes, and the Igapó forests with the rivers flowing from the Brazilian shields and Guyana shields. And we have also the terra firme forests, where there is no, these are non-flooded rainforests in Amazonia basin due to the difference in altitude. So we tried to translate our numerical model into these different habitats, and we observed a continuous transition from Igapó forest to Várzea forests, and intermittent change in the environment. So maybe this dynamic environment with this mosaic of forests was an environment pressure on the organisms that induced the diversification of the biodiversity in Amazonia. Finally, I will present the most recent model where we incorporated climate effects in our model, and we tried to reproduce the influence of the Andean uplift on the precipitation map in South America. And we tried to reproduce the increase in precipitation when we considered the uplift of the Andes and the effect of orographic precipitation. For this, this work was done in collaboration with researchers from the University of Tübingen, including Sebastian Mutz and Todd Ehlers, where we simulated the precipitation considering different altitudes for the Andean Cordillera, with 0 Andes to 100 Andes, the present Andean topography. And in this scenario, we observed the evolution of this aquatic environment in Western Amazonia. And this aquatic environment disappears through time due to the uplift of the Andes and the increase in precipitation and erosion along the Andes and the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River. Extracting a profile, a east-west profile along this model, we could observe the paleoenvironment evolution through time. So this here is the Andean foreland basins, and here is the Amazon basin, and here in the center, the Solomons Basin. We can observe that in the scenario where we took into account paleoclimate derived precipitation, we could reproduce a protected period of aquatic environment in Western Amazonia. And the period between the end of aquatic environments and the onset of the transcontinental Amazon River is smaller in the scenario where we assumed paleoclimate precipitation, complex paleoclimate precipitation. And this is compatible with the well data along the foreland basins, where we observe marine environments up to 12 million years ago in these sedimentary basins. Additionally, we incorporated sea level oscillations to see the impact on the evolution of this aquatic environment. And we extracted the sea level curve from the work from Miller and others. And here's the numerical model, where we can see intermittent influence of aquatic environments and marine environments due to sea level fluctuations and due to the low topography in the Amazon plain. So in this scenario, we observed the intermittent influence of the aquatic environment, and this aquatic environment disappears with the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River. And here is the same plot for the scenario where we considered paleoclimate-derived models and variable sea level. We can see this intermittent influence of marine environments and the transition from marine influence to lacustrine environment, and then this lacustrine environment disappears with the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River. And we observed a correlation of these dynamic polyenvironment with the diversification period of mollusks species in the Peba system, and then these mollusks disappears abruptly in the sedimentary record with the formation of the transcontinental Amazon River, and gave space for the evolution of other organisms like mammals. So this paper was published in EPSL in 2023. And here are the conclusions of my presentation. So our simulations show that dynamic topography is not required to establish drainage between the Andes and the Equatorial Atlantic. However, dynamic topography significantly impacts Western Amazonia's landscape evolution before the transcontinental river formation. With dynamic topography, we can reproduce this huge aquatic environment in Western Amazonia, while in the scenarios without dynamic topography, these aquatic environments are limited to the foreland basins. Variable climate and sea level oscillations can explain the short time interval between the end of marine influence in Western Amazonia and the onset of the transcontinental Amazon River during the late Miocene. And the intermittent marine influence is progressively replaced by fluvial lacustrine environments, probably equivalent to the Peba system. And we propose that this environmental evolution influenced regional biodiversity and the sedimentation history in North and South America, and explain the formation and disappearance of aquatic environments before the onset of the transcontinental Amazon River. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to answer questions.
Thank you so much. So we can also let people unmute themselves if they want to ask a question live, since we're in a smaller committee today. While people might be thinking of how they want to formulate their questions, may I start with the first question? Or Pedro, you have a burning one that you really want to jump in with. It's all right.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was when you nicely showed the evolution of your models with the progressive inclusion of different features. Once you included dynamic topography, I'm not sure I completely understood how you decided or parameterized this dynamic topography. Was it something that you imposed with a single scenario based, for example, on the work of Grace Shepard, or did you? I mean, I guess you understand my question here. Could you tell us more about it?
Yeah, good question. In fact, I didn't explain this in the presentation. The dynamic topography was imposed in the model based on the dynamic topography from Grace Shepard. So we extracted the vertical perturbations in each interval of time, in intervals of 10 million years, and imposed these long wavelength perturbations in our model. So this was added as a vertical displacement in the lithosphere. So this was incorporated in the model in combination with the other vertical perturbations due to isostasy and flexure. So isostasy and flexure is internally calculated solving the equation of the flexure of the lithosphere, but the dynamic topography was imposed.
That's it. Okay. And so in that solution from Grace, is she proposes like a single solution, or is there some varying uncertainties about it, or how much control do you have on that?
That's a good point. And in fact, in their paper, they did some sensitivity analysis, changing some parameters in their model. There is another paper from Nicolas Flamand exploring the dynamic topography in South America. And all these models, they agree for the last 20 million years. But back by time, they have changed due to uncertainties about the rheology of the mantle and the initial state of the mantle, the uncertainties about the tomographic model for the present state of the mantle. So all the models agree with these dynamic topography models. They agree that during the last 20 million years, we observed the tilt of South American plate towards the equatorial margin. But backward in time, we are not completely sure about the dynamic topography evolution backward in time.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to give the floor to Sebastian.
First of all, it was really nice seeing this whole journey again and the increased complexity of models. So I don't have any specific question because I know much of what you've worked on and we've worked on together. But just a very broad question: where to go next? What's the next big gap that you are going to be tackling in the future?
Nice to see you again, Sebastian. It's a pleasure to see you again. And in fact, our research group is working on paleoenvironment evolution for the entire South American plate, not only the northern part, but incorporating the southern portion, where we observed that there is a dynamic capture of the rivers along the foreland basins, connecting the northern drainage basins with the southern drainage basins. But it's still it's still in the beginning of the process. So we are trying to simulate this in the scale of the continent. And additionally, we are in collaboration with some biologists, some evolutionary ecologists, trying to see the impact on the evolution of the organisms. Yeah, but this is
maybe just a very quick follow-up. So this is exciting now, expanding this to the whole continent. Is it as simple as transferring that method to more southern South America, or do you see any potential problems or big challenges just sort of transferring that to the south?
Yeah, we have many challenges. One is the correct amplitude of dynamic topography in the southern portion of South America. The latitudinal variation in the surface process, we assume no latitudinal change in the equations that describe the surface process. In fact, I admit that this surface process is pretty simple. And in fact, my model is not so efficient like new surface process model. We are still using an explicit formulation for surface process, which is very slow. But we didn't have time to implement new formulations like FastScape. And probably we can explore new formulations for surface process too. And so these are the main points that I can observe about the challenge that we can face to understand the landscape evolution in the scale of the continent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Pedro.
Victor, thank you. Thank you so much. This is a great presentation. It's great to see it. And like Sebastian said, the whole journey. I have a couple questions. One is perhaps related to the last question, and it's about the differences in resolution in each process that you're applying to your model. And I wonder, I was just curious to know, what kind of grid resolution you're working with for your surface process model, and how you apply things like the flexural isostasy, and you combine that in the grid? That's the first question. And then the second question is about the effects of the subduction zone dynamics. I know you worked on the subduction zone uh, for a little bit, so I'm wondering if when you start incorporating subduction zones together with mountain building, together with your dynamic topography, if perhaps temporal changes in slab behavior can influence your results.
So thank you, Pedro. It's a pleasure to see you. And again, thank you for this opportunity to present our work. So about the resolution, yeah, this probably is the main bottleneck on our model, because using this explicit formulation, we have a low resolution and a low spatial resolution. And in these scenarios, the distance between the center of the cells is nearly 40 to 50 kilometers in this continental scale. So it's a coarse representation. In this scale, based on previous works, we preferred not to incorporate, for example, diffusion process like landslide process, because in this scale it's difficult to see the details. Only if we reduce the spatial resolution to nearly 1 kilometer, we can see the combination of fluvial and diffusion process. But in this scale, we prefer not to incorporate diffusion. But I think the main problem now is that we have this explicit formulation, and we have to update the model or use, for example, LandLab or other softwares they're much more efficient to run the surface process model, and then we can simulate in a better resolution and see the details about the landscape evolution. And so we intend to do this in the next months and years to explore new surface process formulation. About subduction, in fact, the change in the angle of the subduction affected the amplitude of dynamic topography and the horizontal extension of dynamic topography. So probably the main change in the amplitude of dynamic topography in Western Amazonia was due to changes in the angle of the subduction of the Nazca Plate during the last 40 million years. And I think that the next step is the incorporation of thermomechanical models that simulate the development of the Andean Cordillera and the interaction with the slab subduction. So this is a great challenge for geodynamicists to try to reproduce the development of the Andean Cordillera, not as an imposed feature in our model where we prescribe the crustal thickening rate in the model, but the thickening process is naturally observed from the interaction of the two adjacent plates. So I think this is another big problem for numerical models, geodynamic numerical models, to reproduce the evolution of the geodynamic evolution in combination with surface process. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. I think we've asked already a lot of questions, and so sorry for the noise if that's coming through. I'm in a coffee shop.
No problem.
So, Luca, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah. So thanks again. This will be, of course, uploaded to YouTube, where it joins the large collection of talks we have. thanks again, one last time, Victor. I know that you had to rush, I think, from a classroom to give this seminar, but now you can take a breather. And it was really, really nice to see this progressive iteration of the different components that matter in this question. I will have probably more questions in the future, and I will probably maybe see you at a conference to ask about these two different forests draining from the Andes and the Brazilian Shield. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you for those of you who are live here, and thank you for those of you who are catching up on YouTube. We'll see you next week at 4 p.m. on Thursday. It will be a talk by Julia Cisneros about bed forms as a windows into environmental systems. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.